Hello everyone, I am the Midnight Storyteller. I know you clicked on this video to relax for a while or perhaps to let my voice help you fall asleep. Before you do, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you now? And what time is it? Alright, find a comfortable position and relax. Moving into this old apartment wasn't exactly a happy decision, more one born out of necessity. It was cheap, the walls were somewhat mottled, and the floorboards occasionally groaned in protest, but overall, it had character. I even grew somewhat fond of the enormous old mirror in the bathroom. Its edges tarnished black with oxidation. It took up almost the entire wall, making the otherwise cramped space feel a bit more open, although the glass itself seemed to bear the marks of time. The edges of the reflection always subtly distorted. I'm a night owl, usually doing my washing up late at night, savoring the last bit of solitary quiet in the day. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. Until one Wednesday night, as I was brushing my teeth in front of the mirror as usual, hazy with fatigue. That's when I first felt something was wrong. I felt like my reflection's movements were half a beat slow. Like network lag, my hand had already put down the toothbrush, but the image in the mirror had only just completed the action. I paused, staring at the mirror for a few seconds. The me in the mirror stared back, its expression holding the same trace of confusion as mine. Just tired, I told myself, rubbing my eyes. Maybe it's the light. I didn't pay it much mind. After all, working overtime constantly, it was normal to be mentally foggy. I quickly finished washing up and fled the somewhat overly bright light of the bathroom. But that sense of strangeness, like a seed, had been quietly planted. A few nights later, I stood before the mirror again. This time, I paid closer attention. I tried blinking at the mirror. The image in the mirror seemed to pause for a moment before blinking back. And its eyes. They weren't right. My own eyes should have been full of exhaustion, but the eyes in the mirror looked exceptionally vacant, hollow, even holding a faint, almost imperceptible mockery. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't my imagination. I started doing little tests. I raised my right hand. The reflection raised its left. That was normal. But when I quickly wiggled my fingers, the fingers in the mirror seemed to freeze for an instant before mimicking the movement with extreme stiffness. I stretched my mouth into an exaggerated grin. The corners of the mouth in the mirror merely twitched upward slightly, like a failed imitation. Could it be my brain having trouble processing the mirror image? I tried to find a reason, my hand subconsciously reaching out to touch the mirror's surface, wanting to feel if it was uneven. What my fingertips felt wasn't the slight coolness glass should have, but a bone-chilling cold, like touching metal covered in frost in the depths of winter. That coldness spread rapidly from my fingertips up my arm, making me snatch my hand back violently. I looked around. The bathroom temperature was normal, even a bit warm due to the water heater. But this mirror, it was ice cold, a cold that didn't belong to this world. After that, things got worse. I started catching things in the periphery of the mirror, out of the corner of my eye, a blurry, fast-moving silhouette, as if someone was standing behind me. But every time I spun around or looked directly at the edge of the mirror, there was nothing there, only the pale white wall and the reflection of the light. The nights became long and difficult to endure. I began to dread entering the bathroom, even dread passing the door. Every time I inadvertently glanced inside, I felt that huge mirror was like a silent eye, watching me soundlessly in the darkness. Insomnia became the norm, my nerves were frayed, and the slightest sound would make me jump. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I found a thick bath towel and hung it up, completely covering the mirror, hoping to block that omnipresent gaze. I thought I could find peace this way, but that night, it felt like I could hear the faint, minute rustling sound of fabric rubbing against glass coming from the bathroom all night long, as if someone behind the towel was gently scraping the mirror with their fingernails. The next morning, the towel was on the floor. I tried taping the towel to the wall, but the tape always inexplicably peeled off while I was asleep. It seemed like it didn't want to be covered. A few more days passed. On a particularly silent night, I jerked awake from a light sleep, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I didn't know what woke me. The room was utterly silent, but I could feel an intense, icy sense of being watched, fixed firmly upon me, the source coming from the direction of the bathroom. The bathroom door was ajar somehow, letting out a faint sliver of light. All the blood in my body seemed to freeze, but an irresistible force compelled me out of bed, moving step by step towards it. I peered through the crack in the door. The hanging towel had fallen to the floor again somehow. The mirror was fully exposed in the light, and the me in the mirror was standing there. But it wasn't me. Its face wore an indescribable smile, a mixture of cruelty and delight. Its eyes were no longer hollow but glittered with a malicious light, staring dead at me. Then, under my horrified gaze, it slowly raised a hand, its pale, stiff index finger, pointing directly, unequivocally at me. In that instant, terror overwhelmed me. I couldn't make a sound, but my body moved on its own. I don't know where the strength came from, perhaps pure instinct. I grabbed a heavy ceramic soap dish nearby and, with all my might, hurled it violently at the mirror. Crack, shatter. The crisp sound of breaking exploded in the silent night, accompanied by the sound of countless glass shards flying. I stood there, panting heavily, trembling all over, looking at the mess of broken glass on the floor. Only some remnants of the mirror remained hanging on the wall, reflecting the light in distorted ways. That reflection with the malicious smile was gone. It took me a long time to clean up the shards, cutting my hands in several places, but I didn't feel the pain. The mirror was gone. The wall looked empty and ugly. But the feeling of being mimicked, of being watched, didn't disappear with the shattering of the mirror. Instead, it became even more constant, following me like a shadow. Sometimes in the reflection of a window at night, on the dark surface of a turned-off TV screen, even on the still surface of a glass of water, I seemed to glimpse a fleeting, twisted smile, or a pair of malevolent eyes. I started thinking constantly, what exactly did I shatter that night? Was it really just a mirror, or did I let it or them out of the mirror? Does it no longer need that mirror? This question hangs over me like a new, invisible mirror, leaving me sleepless night after night. Buying the old house felt like stepping into a piece of history. It had stood on this plot for nearly a century, maybe more, the listing agent had said with a vague wave of her hand. It certainly looked its age, charming in daylight perhaps, with its weathered siding and slightly crooked porch, but possessing a certain weight, a presence when dusk began to settle. The floors sighed underfoot. The window panes sometimes rattled even without wind, and the air, especially upstairs near the attic access, always seemed a little cooler, carrying the faint, dry scent of aged wood and forgotten things. The attic itself was, well, an attic, a dusty, dimly lit space accessible only by a rickety pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway ceiling. When I first ventured up there, flashlight beam cutting through the hazy air thick with disturbed dust motes. I found it crammed with the previous owner's detritus. Stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with brittle string, dented metal trunks sealed with rust, ghostly shapes draped in white sheets that turned out to be discarded furniture, cobwebs stretching like macabre decorations between the rough-hewn rafters. It felt dormant, a repository of things left behind, sleeping under layers of grime. I made a mental note to clear it out eventually, maybe turn it into storage space, but for the time being, I secured the flimsy latch on the access panel and tried to put it out of my mind. The house needed work elsewhere first. It was perhaps a week or two after moving in, settling into the rhythms of the old structure, that I first heard it. It started subtly, late one night. I was lying in bed, the house wrapped in the profound silence that only old, somewhat isolated homes possess. At first I thought it was a dripping tap somewhere, or maybe the house settling in a peculiar way. A faint tick, tick, tick. It was incredibly soft, almost at the threshold of hearing. But what struck me even then was its perfect regularity. It wasn't the random creak of wood or the gurgle of pipes. This was precise, measured, like a clock perhaps. But I didn't own any ticking clocks, certainly none loud enough to be heard from downstairs, seemingly emanating from above. I strained my ears in the darkness. Tick, tick, tick. Yes, it was definitely coming from upstairs, specifically from the direction of the attic. It had the steady, unwavering cadence of a metronome, though much quieter. Annoying, perhaps, but nothing more, I reasoned. Maybe some old toy left behind, somehow still operational. A strange draft catching something just right. I managed to dismiss it, eventually drifting off to the monotonous beat. But it wasn't a one-off occurrence. The next night it was there again, and the night after. Always starting sometime after midnight, when the house was at its stillest, and continuing, maddeningly consistent, until the first hints of dawn. Tick, tick, tick. It became a strange, unwanted lullaby. During the day, silence. I climbed the ladder several times in those first few weeks, determined to find the source. Armed with a brighter flashlight, I meticulously combed through the attic clutter. I shifted boxes, peered behind trunks, ran my hands along the rafters, checked the insulation, looked for any sign of pests, faulty wiring, loose vents, anything. There was nothing. No old clocks, no wind-up toys, no mechanism that could conceivably produce such a sound. The dust lay thick and undisturbed in most corners, save for where I had moved things. The air was still and heavy. The silence up there in the daylight felt absolute, almost defiant. It made the nighttime ticking seem even more impossible, more deliberate. My frustration grew into a low hum of anxiety. The sound wasn't loud, but its persistence, its inexplicable nature, began to wear on me. I decided to record it, needing some kind of proof, perhaps for a contractor, perhaps just for my own sanity. I placed my phone on the top step of the attic ladder one night, the microphone aimed towards the darkness above, and hit record. I could hear the faint tick, 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 clearly with my own ears as I retreated downstairs. The next morning, I eagerly played back the recording. My heart sank. There was nothing but the low hiss of ambient noise, the phone's own electronic signature. I skipped through the hours-long file. Static, silence, not a single tick. I tried again the next night with a different recording app, even borrowed a more sensitive digital recorder from a friend. The result was the same. The sound existed only for the human ear, seemingly vanishing when technology tried to capture it. This discovery shifted my unease firmly into the realm of genuine fear. Why would a sound behave like that? Then the rhythm began to change. It wasn't always the same steady tempo anymore. One night, the usually constant tick, tick, tick slowed down dramatically, drawing out each interval until the silence between felt heavy, thick with anticipation, making my skin crawl. It felt like waiting for a breath that never came. Another night, it raced, a frantic, almost panic tempo that mirrored the frantic beating in my own chest as I lay frozen below, listening. It was erratic, desperate, before abruptly settling back into its standard, maddening beat. The most terrifying instance happened about a month into this ordeal. I was lying in bed, rigid with fear, my heart pounding against my ribs. The ticking from above seemed unusually loud that night, and then it synchronized. The ticks began to fall in perfect time with my own racing pulse. Thump tick, thump tick, thump tick. It was undeniable. For a horrifying minute, the sound in the attic matched my body's terror beat for beat. It felt intimate, aware, like something was listening not just to the house but to me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it reverted to its normal, steady pace, leaving me trembling in the darkness, drenched in cold sweat. Sleep became a luxury I rarely achieved. My work performance suffered. I was jumpy, irritable, constantly glancing towards the ceiling. I started avoiding the upstairs hallway, especially near the attic access panel. I began to feel watched, not overtly, but a persistent prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a feeling that my presence in the house was being monitored from above. I made sure the attic latch was secure every single night, even added a small, flimsy bolt I bought from the hardware store, though it felt like a pathetic gesture against something so intangible. Yet, sometimes, late at night, I would hear faint sounds from that direction that weren't the ticking. A soft scraping, as if something brushed against the panel from the inside. Once, a distinct muffled thump, like something heavy had been dropped or had fallen. I'd find faint scratch marks around the bolt in the morning, too faint to be conclusive proof of anything, but enough to fuel my growing paranoia. The dream started soon after. Vivid nightmares set in the dusty confines of the attic. In them, the ticking was oppressively loud, echoing in the enclosed space. And in the center of the room, illuminated by an unseen source, a large, ill-defined shadow would sway rhythmically, back and forth, perfectly in time with the ticking. It never had features, but I felt its attention fixed on me, even in the dream. I would wake up gasping, the phantom ticking still echoing in my ears, my sheets damp. I began to feel like the ticking was counting down the days, the hours, counting down to what? Was it counting down until it could get out? Until I finally broke? The thought circled endlessly in my exhausted mind. I felt trapped in my own home, held hostage by a sound. Weeks turned into months. The ticking became a fixture of my nights, a torment I learned to endure but never ignore. The fear became a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach. Until one night, something inside me snapped. The relentless, precise tick, 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 felt like it was drilling directly into my skull. I couldn't stand another second of it. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline that was equal parts terror and desperate anger, I leaped out of bed. I didn't bother with logic or caution. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a sturdy metal flashlight, and stormed towards the upstairs hallway. My own footsteps felt deafening on the stairs. I reached the pull-down cord for the attic ladder and yanked it down with trembling hands. The ladder unfolded with a protesting groan. Flashlight held high like a weapon, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. I scrambled up the steps and burst into the attic space. The instant my feet hit the attic floorboards, the ticking stopped. Abruptly, utterly. The silence that rushed in was profound, almost deafening. It pressed in on my ears, thick and unnatural after months of the relentless rhythm. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, sweeping across the familiar clutter, the boxes, the shrouded furniture, the cobwebs. Nothing seemed out of place from my last daytime inspection. The air felt cold, stagnant, and heavy with anticipation. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign, any source. Then I saw it. In the very center of the attic, in a small, clear space amidst the junk, sat a single, medium-sized, very old wooden box. It looked plain, unremarkable, its lid slightly askew. I hadn't specifically noticed it before amongst the general chaos, but now it seemed significant. As I took a hesitant step towards it, the lid of the box, slowly, gently, and with impossible smoothness, settled back into place, closing completely with a soft, final click. There was no draft, nothing touched it, it just closed. I stood there, frozen, flashlight beam fixed on the innocuous box. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Whatever had been ticking was either inside that box, or it had simply ceased upon my intrusion. Either possibility was terrifying. I didn't dare touch the box. I backed away slowly down the ladder, pulling it up and securing the hatch with shaking hands. The ticking did not return. Not that night, nor the next. For 3 blissful days, the house was silent at night. Truly silent for the first time since I'd moved in. A fragile sense of relief began to bloom within me. Maybe I had confronted it. Maybe breaking the pattern, invading its space, had been enough to stop it. Maybe it was finally over. I started to sleep again, tentatively at first, then more deeply. On the 4th night, I was lying in bed, exhausted but finally feeling a semblance of peace, drifting towards sleep in the quiet darkness of my bedroom. And then I heard it. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the same sound, the same perfect metronomic regularity, but it wasn't coming from the attic anymore. It was coming from right here in my bedroom, faint but clear, seeming to emanate from directly underneath my bed. Tick, tick, tick. I lie here now, rigid, paralyzed with a fear far deeper than anything I felt before. Every muscle is locked, my eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The sound continues, steady, patient, impossibly close. It followed me. Or perhaps it was never truly confined to the attic at all. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. All I know is that it's here now, under my bed, and I am too terrified to look. Tick, tick, tick. My house backs onto a rather generous patch of lawn, bordered by a somewhat overgrown collection of hedges and a few weary-looking flower beds left by the previous owners. It's a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where lives unfold behind neatly drawn curtains. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and the window offers a clear, slightly elevated view of the entire backyard. I often find myself standing there late at night, unable to sleep, just watching the way the moonlight transforms the familiar shapes of the lawn chairs and the bird bath into something alien and still. It used to be a calming ritual, a way to quiet the noise in my head until he started appearing, The first time I saw him, I genuinely thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, perhaps a side effect of the insomnia I'd been battling. It was well past 2 in the morning, the world outside utterly silent and bathed in the weak, silvery light of a waning moon. Down below, near the ragged rose bushes at the far end of the yard, there was movement. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, was hunched over, engaged in some sort of slow, deliberate activity. From my vantage point, it looked like gardening, digging or weeding, perhaps, at this hour. My first thought was a neighbor, maybe someone eccentric, indulging in some nocturnal horticulture. But the movements, they were wrong. Stiff, jerky, almost mechanical, lacking the natural fluidity of a human body. And the figure itself was indistinct, cloaked in shadow, more a silhouette than a person. I watched for several minutes, a strange unease prickling at the back of my neck. The figure never looked up, never paused, just continued its repetitive, silent labor under the pale moonlight. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just fatigue casting strange shadows. Maybe an animal I couldn't quite make out, and forced myself back to bed, though sleep remained elusive. But he was there again the next night, and the night after that, always appearing sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., always in a slightly different part of the yard, always engaged in that same silent, unnervingly stiff gardening. Sometimes he seemed to be pruning bushes that didn't need pruning, his arms moving in sharp, unnatural arcs. Other times he knelt, appearing to dig methodically in the flower beds with bare hands, though I could never be sure from the distance. He never brought tools, he never made a sound, he just worked. The initial confusion morphed into a creeping dread. I started actively looking for him, drawn to the window each night by a morbid mix of fear and compulsion. Who or what gardened in the dead of night with such relentless, unnatural focus? I began scrutinizing the yard during the daytime, searching for clues, and I found them. Small patches of soil looked freshly disturbed, though no specific planting seemed to have occurred. There were footprints sometimes, too, oddly deep impressions in the soft earth near the flower beds, sometimes looking like bare feet, even on cold nights. They didn't match my own shoes, nor did they seem to belong to any animal I could identify. I casually asked my immediate neighbors if they'd noticed anything unusual, perhaps someone new tending to their yard late at night. They looked at me with mild confusion, shook their heads, mentioned maybe seeing a raccoon or a stray cat. Their dismissal only amplified my isolation, my certainty that what I was seeing was something else. Then, the yard itself began to change. It started subtly. The roses on that bush he frequented began to bloom out of season, but the color was wrong. A deep blackish red, velvety and disturbing, like dried blood. The petals felt oddly brittle to the touch. Patches of lawn where I'd seen him kneeling turned a sickly, yellowish brown, while adjacent areas sometimes erupted in an unnaturally vibrant, almost fluorescent green. An old oak tree near the back fence, one I was sure he'd spent time near, started twisting its branches into gnarled, agonized shapes that hadn't been there before. The changes were gradual, week by week, but undeniable, transforming my mundane backyard into something subtly grotesque, a canvas being repainted by an unseen, malevolent artist. The figure itself also seemed clearer somehow, less a trick of shadow, more a defined entity, still tall, still gaunt, wrapped in what looked like dark, tattered clothing. But the most horrifying aspect was the realization that it wasn't just blurry, it was blank. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse like polished dark wood or stretched canvas. Seeing that absence, that void where human features should reside, sent a colder wave of fear through me than any monstrous visage could have. Driven by a desperate need for proof, or perhaps just validation that I wasn't losing my mind, I bought a cheap motion-activated security camera and mounted it overlooking the yard. I angled it carefully, ensuring it covered the areas he frequented. The first night I barely slept. constantly checking the live feed on my phone. Nothing. The second night, the same. On the third night, I woke around 3 a.m. with that familiar sense of unease, crept to the window, and saw him there near the twisted oak tree. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone, opened the app, only to be met with a screen full of static, or sometimes just a frozen image from hours earlier. The recordings for that specific time frame? Corrupted, unreadable. Every single time I knew he was out there, the camera mysteriously failed. It felt less like a technical glitch and more like deliberate interference. It knew. The feeling of being watched intensified. Before, it felt like I was observing it. Now, it felt mutual. Sometimes the figure would abruptly stop its repetitive task, straighten its tall, thin frame, and slowly turn its blank, featureless head directly towards my window. It wouldn't move further, just stand there, oriented towards me, for long, agonizing minutes. In those moments, the air in my bedroom felt thick, heavy, charged with unseen energy. My breath would catch in my throat, and I'd feel an overwhelming urge to duck down, to hide, even though I knew the curtains were drawn. It felt like being pinned by an invisible, malevolent gaze. The silent confrontation was terrifying, shifting the dynamic from mere observation to something potentially predatory. My mental state deteriorated. Sleep deprivation left me jumpy and irritable during the day. I found it hard to concentrate at work, my thoughts constantly drifting back to the featureless gardener and the grotesque transformation of my yard. I started obsessively checking the locks on my doors and windows, even though he had never shown any sign of trying to enter the house. The yard, once a source of potential pleasure, became a zone of anxiety. I stopped going out there unless absolutely necessary. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly under surveillance by something I couldn't comprehend. Was it a ghost? An alien? Some earth elemental drawn to the neglected soil? My rational mind scrabbled for explanations, but found none that fit the chilling reality of the situation. The climax arrived on a night thick with the threat of a storm. The air was heavy, humid and unnaturally still before the first drops began to fall. Then the heavens opened, driving rain, flashes of lightning that bleached the world white for brief, terrifying instants, followed by rumbling thunder that shook the house. Despite my fear, or perhaps because of it, I was drawn to the window, peering out between the slats of the blinds. He was there, standing directly in the center of the lawn, motionless, seemingly oblivious to the torrential downpour. He wasn't gardening now, just standing, waiting. Then, a particularly bright fork of lightning flashed, illuminating the entire yard with stark, cold light. For one horrifying second, I saw his face clearly. Or rather, the absence of it. Where features should have been, there was only a tangled, pulsing mass of dark, wet roots, slick with rain, writhing like a nest of serpents. It wasn't skin, but living, moving earth and vegetation, shaped into a grotesque mockery of a human head. The sight punched the air from my lungs. A strangled gasp escaped me, and I stumbled backward from the window, nausea churning in my stomach. I slammed the blinds shut, my body trembling uncontrollably. I never looked out at the yard at night again. I kept the curtains in my bedroom permanently drawn after dark. I even considered moving rooms. But some part of me felt that showing such fear would only encourage it. I tried to pretend the yard didn't exist once the sun went down. But the silence didn't bring peace. Instead, a new horror began. It started faintly, easily dismissed as the house settling or the wind. A soft rustling, a dry, papery scratching sound. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. Specifically, from within the walls of my bedroom, the very walls that bordered the backyard. The sound grew clearer over the following nights. A persistent, irregular scratching and whispering, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or like roots, like the sound of determined fibrous roots forcing their way through soil, or plaster, or wood. It concentrated near the baseboards, seeming to travel along the wall adjacent to the yard where the twisted oak stood, where the ground bore those strange footprints. I lie in bed now, night after night, listening to it. The curtains are drawn tight, but the barrier feels meaningless. The scratching within the walls is a constant reminder. It found a way in. Or perhaps its influence was always capable of breaching the mundane separation between outside and inside. The midnight gardener may remain physically in the yard, but his work, it seems, continues, burrowing closer, right here beside me in the dark. The silence outside is now filled with the insidious sound from within, and I wonder how long it will be before the plaster cracks. Living on the 27th floor of the Argent Tower has its perks. The view, mostly. A sprawling panorama of city lights that can almost make you forget the anonymous nature of high-rise life. But it also means a near-total reliance on the elevators. There are 4, housed in a central bank off the main lobby. Sleek, modern lifts with brushed steel doors and quietly humming machinery. Or usually quiet. I use them multiple times a day, every day. Going to work, coming home, taking out the trash, grabbing groceries. They are an unavoidable part of my existence here, a vertical lifeline. I never gave them much thought, beyond the occasional impatience when waiting, or the mild awkwardness of sharing the small space with silent neighbors. They were just elevators, functional, predictable, until they weren't. The first time it happened, it was subtle enough to dismiss. I was heading up after work, alone in car number 3. I pressed the button for 27. The doors slid shut, the soft chime sounded, and the ascent began. But instead of stopping at my floor, it stopped at 23. The chime sounded again, the door slid open. Nobody was there. The hallway looked normal, just empty. I frowned, checked the panel. Only 27 was illuminated. Someone must have pressed the button and then walked off, I muttered, pressing the door close button with a flicker of annoyance. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its journey to my floor without further incident. Strange, but explainable. A few days later, it happened again. This time, heading down in the morning rush, though momentarily alone in the car. It stopped on 14. Doors opened, empty hallway. Again, I assumed a ghost press or someone changing their mind, but a tiny sliver of unease lodged itself in my mind. The third time, the rationalizations began to fray. It was late, after midnight, and I was the only soul venturing upwards. I stepped into car number 2, pressed 27. The elevator ascended smoothly past the lower floors, the numbers lighting up sequentially above the door. Then somewhere around the 19th or 20th floor, I couldn't be sure because the indicator suddenly went blank. The elevator slowed and stopped. Not with the usual gentle halt, but with a slight, unsettling jolt. The chime sounded, duller this time. The doors slid open. It wasn't a numbered floor. The hallway beyond was dark, unfinished. Bare concrete walls loomed, coated in a fine layer of dust that seemed to absorb the weak light spilling from the elevator car. There were no doors, no light fixtures, just the oppressive darkness stretching away. The air that drifted in smelled stale, like damp earth and old construction materials. I stared, bewildered. There was no button for a floor like this on the panel. It didn't officially exist. My heart began to beat a little faster. I jabbed the door close button, relief washing over me as the steel panels slid shut, sealing away the sight of that non-existent corridor. The indicator above the door flickered back to life, showing 21, and the elevator resumed its ascent as if nothing had happened. That was the beginning. From then on, these stops became more frequent, but with a disturbing new pattern. They only occurred when I was completely alone in the elevator car, never when someone else was riding with me. It felt personal, targeted. Stepping into an empty elevator became an exercise in quiet dread. Would it take me where I wanted to go, or would it make an unscheduled stop in nowhere? And the nature of the stops evolved. It wasn't just the wrong floors or the empty, unfinished ones anymore. Sometimes the doors would open onto a corridor identical to a normal floor, but utterly devoid of light, plunged into an unnerving, absolute darkness. Other times, the air inside the elevator car itself would change during these stops. The temperature would plummet, a sudden, unnatural chill raising goosebumps on my arms, a cold that felt damp and invasive, entirely separate from the building's climate control. Occasionally, accompanying the chill, I would hear sounds, faint, barely audible sighs seeming to emanate from the very walls of the elevator car. Not human sighs, more like the slow exhalation of stale air from something vast and hollow, or a soft, almost inaudible whispering just at the edge of perception, impossible to decipher but undeniably present. The glimpses started soon after. When the doors opened onto those dark, empty floors, I began to see things, or rather, the impression of things. A flicker of rapid movement at the far end of the concrete hallway, gone before my eyes could focus. A shape that seemed to detach itself from the deeper shadows near a support pillar, only to melt back in when the elevator light hit it. Once the brief, terrifying impression of something tall and stick-thin, standing just beyond the threshold, its form lost in the oppressive gloom. I never saw anything clearly, just these fleeting, peripheral suggestions that left my palms sweating and my pulse roaring in my ears. One night, the elevator stopped on one of those unfinished floors, the dusty concrete stretching into blackness beyond the open doors. And the doors stayed open. Usually they'd pause for a few seconds, then close automatically. This time they remained wide, inviting entry into the void. Seconds stretched into an eternity. I frantically stabbed the door close button, my breath catching in my throat. The button remained stubbornly unresponsive for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only 30 seconds. But in that time, trapped in the lit box facing the abyss, I felt pressure. Not a physical touch, but an intense feeling that something outside was considering stepping in, that something was standing just on the threshold, observing me, deciding. The air grew heavy, the silence profound, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. Finally, with a reluctant groan, the doors slid shut, and I slumped against the wall, gasping for air. That incident marked a turning point. I started taking the stairs whenever I could, especially when alone or late at night. 27 flights. It was exhausting, time-consuming, often leaving me breathless and sweating by the time I reached my apartment or the lobby. But the physical exertion felt preferable to the psychological torment of the elevator. Yet even the stairs didn't offer a complete escape. Several times after hauling myself up or down those long flights, I would arrive on my floor, heart pounding, legs aching, only to hear it. The soft, familiar ding of an elevator arriving moments later. I would turn instinctively towards the elevator bank, and there it would be, car number 2 or 3, maybe 1. The light above its door illuminated, indicating it had stopped on my floor. The doors remained closed. No one had called it, no one got out. It just sat there, waiting, as if it knew I had taken the stairs and it had followed, patiently arriving just after me. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as coincidence. The third time, a cold dread settled in my stomach. It felt like I was being watched, tracked, even taunted by the very machinery of the building. My anxiety spiraled. I became jumpy, sleep-deprived. I started noticing the elevators even when I wasn't near them. The low hum resonating through the building seemed menacing now. I'd observe other residents, trying to gauge if they experienced anything similar, but they all seemed oblivious, chatting on their phones or lost in thought during their vertical journeys. Was I the only one? Was something in the building, or about the building, specifically targeting me? The inevitable happened one rainy Tuesday evening. I was coming home late from work, exhausted, and carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries. The lobby was deserted. The thought of climbing 27 flights in my weary state, laden with bags, felt unbearable. The elevators sat there, doors closed, lights indicating they were all on the ground floor, waiting. It's probably fine, I told myself, trying to muster some courage. Maybe it only happens when it's really late, or when I'm thinking about it. Against my better judgment, fueled by exhaustion and the driving rain outside, I pressed the up button. Car number 4 arrived with a gentle chime. The doors slid open. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, placing my bags carefully on the floor. I pressed 27. The doors closed, and the ascent began. Floor after floor slipped by uneventfully. 5, 10, 15. Maybe it was fine this time. Maybe I had been letting my fear get the better of me. 20, 21, 22. Then the elevator shuddered slightly and stopped. The indicator light went blank. My blood turned to ice. A different chime sounded, lower pitched, resonant. The doors slid open. It was one of the empty floors. Darkness, dust, the smell of cold concrete. And standing there, perfectly still, positioned directly in the center of the doorway just a few feet away, was me. Or rather, a figure that looked exactly like me, wearing the same clothes I had on, holding the same weary posture. Its face was mine, yet utterly devoid of expression. Blank eyes stared forward, unblinking. And then, slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand, my hand, and beckoned. A single silent gesture inviting me to step out into the darkness with it. Panic, raw and absolute, seized me. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My fingers flew to the control panel, stabbing wildly at the door close button. Close, close, close. The figure remained motionless, hand outstretched, expression unchanging. The doors felt agonizingly slow, but finally they began to slide shut. The last thing I saw before they sealed completely was that blank, identical face, and the beckoning hand still reaching. The elevator jolted back into motion. The indicator light reappeared, showing 25. It continued to 27 without further stops. When the doors opened onto my familiar, well-lit hallway, I stumbled out, leaving one of my grocery bags behind. I fumbled with my keys, heart threatening to burst from my chest, finally making it inside my apartment and slamming the door, leaning against it, gasping, trembling. I haven't ridden the elevator alone since. If I absolutely must use it, I wait until other people are going my way, enduring the awkward silence just for the feeling of safety in numbers. Mostly, I take the stairs, all 27 flights. But it doesn't feel over. Sometimes, late at night, standing in the quiet hallway outside my apartment, I hear it, the soft ding. I turn towards the elevator bank, and one of the lights is lit up, number 4 usually. It has arrived on my floor, uncalled. The doors remain closed. Just sits there, waiting. It knows where I live, and I feel with chilling certainty that it's only a matter of time before it invites me somewhere else. Inheriting the old farmhouse from a distant relative I barely knew felt less like a windfall and more like an obligation. It stood several miles down a poorly maintained gravel road, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides and overgrown fields on the 4th. The nearest neighbor was a dot on the horizon. Cell service was patchy at best. Reliable internet, a distant dream. The house itself was a time capsule. Layers of dust coated everything. Furniture huddled under ghostly white sheets. The air thick with the scent of old paper, dried herbs, and a faint, underlying dampness. It was profoundly quiet, an isolation so complete it felt less peaceful and more watchful. Among the relics of a life I never knew, sitting on a small, scarred wooden table in the corner of the living room, was an old radio. It was a beautiful thing, in its way. A large, tombstone-shaped model from maybe the 40s or 50s, with a dark, swirling bakelite casing, a fabric-covered speaker grill, and large, chunky knobs. It looked entirely defunct, its plug frayed, its surface coated in a fine film of dust. I thought about cleaning it up, maybe seeing if it could be repaired. A nostalgic touch for the otherwise slightly dreary room. For the first few weeks, I mostly ignored it, focusing on the more urgent tasks of making the house habitable. The silence of the house, especially at night, was absolute. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, just the occasional creak of the old timbers settling, or the wind sighing through the eaves and rattling the ill-fitting window frames. It was into this profound silence that the radio first intruded. I was in bed reading by the dim light of a bedside lamp, the only sound my own breathing. Suddenly, a soft crackle split the quiet, followed by a low hum and the unmistakable hiss of static. It came from the living room. My heart jumped. My first thought was faulty wiring, a short circuit, a terrifying prospect in a house this old and remote. I grabbed a flashlight, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the wooden floorboards as I hurried downstairs. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. The sound was definitely coming from the old radio. The dial light, which I was sure hadn't worked, now cast a faint, sickly yellow glow. Static poured from the speaker grill. I reached out and firmly twisted the off knob. The static cut out, the light died. Silence returned. I checked the plug. It was firmly in the wall socket, though the cord looked ancient. Shaking my head, attributing it to the house's character, I went back to bed, making a mental note to unplug it in the morning. But I forgot, and the next night around the same time, just as I was drifting off, the crackle hiss returned. Annoyed and slightly unnerved, I went down, twisted the knob off again. This time I unplugged it, coiling the frayed cord beside the silent machine. That should be the end of it, I thought. It wasn't. The following night, I lay in bed, listening to the wind outside. Then softly it began again. Crackle, hiss. From the living room, my blood ran cold. I sat bolt upright, straining my ears. It was quieter this time, fainter, but definitely there. And it was coming from the radio, the unplugged radio. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my fatigue. I didn't go downstairs that night. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the faint, impossible static drifting up from the floor below, my mind racing with explanations, each more outlandish than the last. From then on, The radio became a nightly presence, always late, always starting with that soft crackle and hiss. It wasn't loud, more like a background murmur, but knowing it was impossible, knowing it was unplugged, made it infinitely more disturbing. I stopped trying to rationalize it. This wasn't faulty wiring or a freak power surge. It was something else. Then the whispers started. At first, they were almost imperceptible, buried deep within the white noise. Stray fluctuations in the static that sounded like voices, perhaps, the way one sees faces in clouds. Auditory pareidolia, my rational mind insisted. But night after night, listening intently in the oppressive silence, the impression grew stronger. The fluctuations began to take on a cadence, a rhythm. It was like listening to a distant conversation through a thick wall. The words unintelligible, but the presence of speech undeniable. The change was gradual, insidious. Over weeks, those vague susurrations sharpened. One night, amidst the steady shh of the static, I heard it, clear as a bell, though faint. My own name, Thomas. Just once. It sent a jolt through me like an electric shock. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear more. Only static answered. Did I imagine it? But it happened again a few nights later. And then again. Sometimes my name, sometimes other fragments. Words I recognized, but stripped of context. Then came the truly chilling part. It started whispering things it shouldn't know. A fragment of a private thought I'd had earlier that day. A reference to a childhood memory I hadn't spoken of in years. A fear I barely acknowledged even to myself, hinted at in a sibilant rush of static. The feeling of violation was profound. It was like having my mind quietly, persistently rifled through by an unseen intruder. The isolation of the house amplified the paranoia. There was no one to tell, no one who would believe me. I was alone with this whispering machine. Its power source remained a terrifying mystery. It sat there inert and unplugged during the day, only to come alive after midnight, humming faintly, whispering secrets from its dusty speaker. The whispers began to take on an emotional quality too. No longer just neutral fragments. Sometimes they sounded pleading, desperate. Help me. So cold. Let me out. Sending shivers down my spine. Other times they were angry, filled with a low, venomous hiss, spitting out fragmented curses or insults I couldn't quite decipher. Occasionally, buried deep within the static, I'd hear something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. Dry, grating, utterly devoid of humor. The entity, because by now I was convinced it was an entity communicating through this object, felt increasingly malevolent, or perhaps just complex, unknowable. I had to get rid of it. One Saturday afternoon, filled with resolve born of sleeplessness and fear, I decided to destroy it. I went downstairs, armed with a heavy wrench from the shed. The radio sat silently on its table, looking old and harmless in the daylight. As I approached, a dull throbbing started behind my eyes. I ignored it, raised the wrench, and a wave of intense dizziness washed over me. My grip faltered. The heavy wrench slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the floorboards. At the same time, the headache intensified, a sharp stabbing pain. It felt like resistance, like something actively preventing me. I tried again, picking up the wrench. The headache pulsed violently. My vision blurred slightly. I felt a profound, inexplicable reluctance, an almost physical inability to bring the wrench down on the bakelite casing. Defeated and shaken, I retreated, the headache receding as soon as I left the living room. I tried simply throwing it out. I managed to lift it. It felt heavier than it looked. and carried it towards the front door. But as I reached the threshold, an overwhelming wave of nausea and vertigo hit me. I felt like I would collapse if I took another step outside with it. It was as if the house itself, or the entity tied to the radio, refused to let it leave. The feeling of being influenced grew stronger. I started having thoughts that didn't feel like my own. Sudden, irrational fears, fleeting urges to do strange things. I'd catch myself humming discordant tunes I vaguely recognized from the radio's static. My own memories felt porous, as if something else was sifting through them, leaving greasy fingerprints. The radio wasn't just a speaker. It felt like a conduit, a bridgehead into my own mind, and the isolation of this place left me utterly vulnerable. The climax came unexpectedly, without any particular build-up that night. The whispers had been fairly quiet, a low, sibilant murmur from downstairs. I was trying to read, forcing myself to ignore it. Then the quality of the static changed. It deepened, thickened, and the whispers coalesced. A voice emerged. Not one voice, but many, layered and distorted, male and female, young and old, all speaking in a grotesque, dragging chorus. It spoke with chilling clarity, filling the silent house. "We know you're listening, Thomas." The multi-voiced entity paused, the static swirling around the words. "We're right behind you." Pure, unadulterated terror shot through me. I dropped my book, spun around in bed, eyes darting wildly into the shadows of my room. There was nothing there, only the familiar shapes of furniture, the moonlight painting patterns on the floor. The voice from the radio cut off abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the sound itself. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I sat there trembling, for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, certain that unseen eyes were watching me from the darkness. The next morning, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, I finally succeeded in removing the radio. I don't know why it let me this time. Perhaps the direct communication had satisfied it, or perhaps my terror had reached a pitch that overrode its resistance. I wrapped it in multiple layers of thick blankets, tied it shut with rope, carried it out to my car, feeling dizzy but pushing through it, drove for nearly an hour to a remote landfill, and threw it into the deepest pit I could find, burying it under heaps of refuse. Driving away, I felt a fragile sense of victory, of liberation. The house was silent that night, blissfully, completely silent. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The peace lasted less than a week. It started subtly again. A strange buzz from my cell phone when there was no notification. The laptop fan seeming to hum at an irregular pitch. The television screen flickering with odd static patterns, even when off. At first, I dismissed it. Normal electronic quirks. Then I started hearing it. Within the phone buzz, within the fan's hum, within the TV static, faint, whisper-like patterns, familiar patterns. Sometimes, late at night when my phone is charging on the nightstand, I can hear, just barely, from its speaker, "Thomas." I got rid of the radio, but the entity, it just found new conduits. It's adaptable, it learned. It's still here, in the hum of the wires, in the crackle of the speakers, in the background noise of the technology that surrounds me. The silence I craved is now filled with a different kind of listening, a constant nerve-wracking vigilance, straining to hear the whispers in the static, knowing that the voice that spoke from the old radio might speak again, any time, from anywhere. It didn't need the box. It just needed me to listen.